Hey everyone, Gill Gross here. Big Jannik Sinner news to tackle. We found out yesterday that back in March during Indian Wells, he tested positive for the banned substance clostebol, which is an anabolic steroid, twice. We also found out yesterday that an independent tribunal found that Sinner bears no fault or negligence for the anti-doping rule violations. A couple things to look at here. We'll talk about the validity of Jannik Sinner's claim to innocence. But before we get into that and the specifics of the drug, and there's some interesting stuff to dive into on that, we got to look at the process. Because the process that played out in the wake of Sinner's adverse findings, his failed drug test, clearly very different from the process that usually plays out. Normally, when a player fails a drug test, there is a provisional suspension triggered, and the public is notified once that provisional suspension is triggered. What ended up happening is Jannik Sinner's lawyers filed immediate appeal of both of those provisional suspensions immediately upon being notified of the failed test. And those appeals were quickly processed and accepted, and therefore Jannik Sinner could continue to play. And it is written in the rules that you may file an immediate appeal for these provisional suspensions, and that they should be processed quickly. But it is still very hard to understand, and I don't have answers for you on this, but I have some theories. It is still very hard to understand why Jannik Sinner and his team is the only real example, high profile at least, of this sort of thing being successfully pulled off. Now you could say, well, he was adamant about his innocence and he had low amount found and he had explanation for how the substance entered his body. And those things are all true. But when you look at Simona Halep and Tara Moore and Beatrice Haddad-Maia and Diana Yastremska and Marin Cilic, well, it was true for all of them. All of these players were adamant about their innocence and had ultimately successful appeal cases, or at least partially successful appeal cases that resulted in reduced suspensions. But none of them were able to avoid the provisional suspension. Not only was Sinner's appeal approved, but the speed at which it was approved. Because one of the main issues that Simona Halep and Tara Moore and others have had with this entire program, this anti-doping program, is that oftentimes the appeal process takes so long that it's not uncommon for the appeal process to actually outlast the duration of the suspension. In other words, once they finally come to a decision, the player had sat out on the provisional suspension longer than the actual suspension. Longer. I don't want to get too, complex here, but essentially the process usually takes forever. So many players have been frustrated, and that was not Jannik's experience here. First of all, before I kind of get into maybe the reasons why Sinner had a speedier process, I feel that more should play out in the Sinner way. That's my opinion. I've expanded on that and elaborated on that in talking about the Simona Halep case recently, which you can go back and look for if you'd like. But I do not believe in the provisional suspension. We have the vast majority of initial rulings by the ITIA overturned or reduced in appeals. In other words, usually when players fail drug tests, the initial suspension is reduced or overturned. And when you look at that happening the vast majority of the time, it leads me to feel that due process should be completed before punishment begins. That's my opinion. I think due process should be completed before punishment begins. So the way it played out for Sinner is actually the way I think it should play out for most players. Again, though, the inconsistency is impossible to ignore and unacceptable, and the lack of transparency has always been frustrating when it comes to anti-doping. There are some reasons that might explain why Sinner was able to get these immediate appeals on the provisional suspensions successfully through. One, better lawyers who responded faster. These lower-ranked players, Nicholas Jarry is another one that I could have mentioned in these names. Some of these lower-ranked players probably did not react as swiftly or as expertly as Jannik Sinner reacted. And that is probably true. It is also true that clostebol contaminations are well known at this point. And we'll get more into this, but it's been almost commonplace in Italian sports for clostebol contaminations to occur, and therefore it was probably quite easy to identify the source of the contamination, and it would have been something that the arbitrators could be very familiar with, and there's lots of precedent that suggests, oh yeah, this happens a lot. That may have helped Jannik in the speedy appeal process. It also likely helped Jannik that he's world number one and a megastar and a superstar and a revenue generator. Because I do doubt that if world number 150 experienced the same thing, that the process would have played out in the same way. I do doubt it. And, I don't want to be speculative. I want to go by the books and I want to, deal in facts. But the lack of transparency, first of all, sometimes makes that difficult. And secondly, all I can really go by is precedent and what I've seen with players who have contaminated supplements or, stories about how certain things were transferred. And when you look at players who are adamant about their innocence and have ultimately successful appeals, and none of them have been able to contend with the provisional suspension, the inconsistency is impossible to ignore. So here is Sinner's story. A spray was used to treat a cut on the thumb of Sinner's physiotherapist. He then massaged Sinner, and the spray, which contained the banned substance, got into Jannik's open wounds, which I believe were apparently in Jannik's foot. A little bit gross. The tribunal believed that alibi. The amount found was determined to be less than performance enhancing. I do find it funny that people say like a billionth of a whatever, like they say the exact amount. That means nothing to me. We're not scientists, okay? So, I mean, what does that even mean? A billionth of a gram? I mean, think about it. This much vodka makes you drunk. That much beer doesn't. Okay, we don't know how these substances. So anyway, I think that's pretty silly. However, scientists, experts, determined that the amount was found to be less than performance enhancing at the time of the test. There is a penalty. Jannik stripped of rankings points from Indian Wells and stripped of prize money from Indian Wells. Those are the rules. When you fail a drug test, regardless of fault or negligence, you are stripped of rankings points and prize money at the site of that failed test. So does this all pass the smell test? The answer is mostly, but opinions may vary. Let me lay out the facts. Between 2019 and 2023, 38 Italian athletes have tested positive for clostebol, despite the fact that it is scarcely produced in oral or injectable form by pharmaceutical companies. It is mainly found in creams. And by the way, I should say the vast majority of the information that I am about to share comes from Edmund Willison, who does a fantastic newsletter, or Substack, I should say, called Honest Sport. He is a journalist who investigates doping in sport full time. And before yesterday, before any of this was known, he had done deep dives on clostebol, and in particular, the prominence and frequency of clostebol positives among Italian athletes. So again, 38 Italian athletes between 2019 and 2023. Now, according to the World Anti-Doping Agency, half of the world's clostebol cases come from Italy. In most countries, clostebol isn't sold. Does this cream thing make any sense? Well, in 2020, Rome's anti-doping laboratory did a test to determine the merits of accidental clostebol claims, and they were able to find clostebol in the urine sample of people who applied the cream to others. That's how contagious isn't the right word. And I know there's a better word, but it's the only one that I have. That's how contagious this cream is. That if by merely handling it, it can be found in blood samples. It's that sensitive. So knowing that this cream is produced in mass without a prescription in Italy, knowing that it is so pervasive and so easily transmitted into the bloodstream, it becomes very easy to see how an athlete like Jannik Sinner could have clostebol in the bloodstream based on his physio using this cream on one of his wounds. However, innocence in this case is not so straightforward or so conclusive, and it never is when it comes to doping in elite sport. One, there is a warning sign on clostebol creams for doping substances, a big one. It is law in Italy that if you are selling a medication that can compromise athletes when they do doping tests, so basically if you are selling something that contains an anabolic steroid, you have to put a warning on the package. That warning is large. So how could Sinner's physiotherapist be so stupid? That is a question. It is also true that you can dope with this substance. So just because it is plausible that the substance is produced in Italy and that it is easily transferred into the bloodstream, that doesn't mean you can't abuse it. The window in which it can be detected, according to Willison, is very short, and if you do apply it daily, you can get benefit. And the amount detected in a test sample could reflect timing rather than dosing. So the reality is, the more you think critically about doping in elite sport, the more uncomfortable you're likely to be. And this is not a statement on Sinner. This is a statement on doping in sport as a whole. Testing systems have limitations. When there are positives, even looking at every piece of evidence is often not enough to be sure of what happened. So tribunals and experts come together and they formulate opinions. But opinions are opinions. And these things are just not as objective as we would all like them to be. Anti-doping is more subjective than most people are truly comfortable with. So I think this comes down to personal inclinations. If you're a skeptic, there is enough reason to be skeptical, but you're likely, therefore, skeptical of, many of these contaminated supplement cases. You're likely skeptical of Haddad Maia and Yastremska and Jari and Cilic. But if you are an optimist, there's also plenty of reason to be optimistic based on the context of clostebol and Italian athletes and what the drug is and all of that stuff. I'm more of an optimist personally. I'm also a journalist. I feel a responsibility to err on the side of absolute fairness when I can. And for me, fairness is certainly laying out the facts and laying out the possibilities, but ultimately considering him the clean athlete that he was found to be by the tribunal. Hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.